Okay. Thank you so much, Eli, for the kind introduction. So I'd like to start with these two things that are characteristic, I think, of internal migration in China. The first one is quite well known, which is the eviction of migrant workers in low-income sectors in Beijing in December 2017. And this was following a fire in a migrant worker department in the suburbs of Beijing that killed 19 people. And the people were referred to as low-end population, with quotation marks, in some official documents. And then the second one is probably less known. It's a farewell event for the so-called returnee children to say goodbye to Shenzhen. So they have been grown up in the city, but then they have to return to the hometown of their parents to continue their education. And this was organized by some civil society organizations, and they were doing it in 6 cities, in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Nanjing, Xiamen, and some other cities. And according to this organization, 90,000 students finishing primary school from these 6 cities have to go back in, again in quotation marks, because they have little to no experience with those places. The places are the hometown of their parents, and they will become left behind children there because their parents will continue to work in these coastal cities. So with this, I'd like to invite you to think about the relativity of membership and boundaries of membership and rights. So it's about when does crossing boundaries, internal boundaries within the nation state matter, and when does one become a migrant? And that is to say, their movement across certain socially constructed boundaries becomes problematized as an object of governing. A person migrating from, for example, Aarhus to Copenhagen, where I am based now, wouldn't be considered a migrant. In fact, a Swedish citizen moving from Stockholm to Copenhagen usually isn't a migrant either. That means their mobility isn't a problem or isn't problematized by the government, and they rarely have problems accessing equal civil, political, and social rights, just like the locals. Apart from formal legal rights, there is also the problem of identity and belonging, of course, in the context of international migration. A second-generation immigrant from with Danish citizenship from a non-Western country is still framed as a migrant in the public discourse in this country. All this is to say that migration is a lot more than crossing territorial boundaries, and also a lot more than crossing national territorial boundaries. So this is the outline of my presentation today. I'll start with some boring conceptual issues, clarifying some concepts, and then I'll look at Hukou. I spent much more time on the second topic than what I will do with this third topic, because the third topic is sort of work in progress. So I spent much of the time talking about Hukou reforms and what that means for differentiated citizenship in contemporary China. And then I'll talk a little on Suju as a marker of difference and hierarchy, and how it defines an ideal citizenry. So conventional approaches to citizenship talk about these different layers or elements of the concept. Typically legal status, the passport you have, the nationality you have on your passport, and the kind of rights it endows, practice, or democratic participation and identity. So normally in conventional sort of citizenship theory, you could say that there are liberal, Republican, and communitarian conceptions of it, and with respective focus on rights. Liberal concept would focus on rights, Republican concept would focus on democratic participation, and the communitarian approach would focus on identity and so on. But beyond this, two alternative perspectives have in particular shaped my initial interests in citizenship studies. The first looks at those acts or ruptures, even of performances beyond our normal understanding of what democratic participation means, and through which the excluded, such as undocumented migrants or asylum seekers, refugees, constitute themselves as citizens or political subjects. And then the second one focuses on citizenship as governmental strategies that produce exclusions and stratifications. And these technologies and discourses of citizenship also create specific forms of subjectivity. For example, liberal citizenship would be about rational, autonomous self-interests, liberal subjects. So this is what I mean when I talk about technology of citizenship in the title. So today, when I want to talk about Hukou and Suzhi as technologies of citizenship in China, and if I use Eisen's, so Eisen is the theorist that is best known for the acts of citizenship approach. We could say that Hukou is about the extent of citizenship, so defining the boundary of rights. And Suju is about the depth of citizenship, about the qualities of what an ideal modern citizen means or entails, requires. But maybe there are better terms. I think there are probably better terms to describe these dimensions of Chinese citizenship. So next, I also want to mention the concept of social citizenship. One of the best known theorists of this is British sociologist T.H. Marshall, who defines social citizenship as, in a nutshell, the right to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevailing in the society. And in concrete terms, this typically is comprised of welfare institutions, ideals of national solidarity, and provision of social rights as something distinct from civil and political rights. And of course, this is quite a Eurocentric framework, and it needs to be put into the historical context. And so it's mainly a 20th century development in the European welfare state. From the bottom-up perspective, you could say it's achieved through labor struggles. And from a top-down perspective, you could say that it's a sort of responses taken by the state to neutralize the antagonism between capital and labor. The reason why this is relevant is because I conceptualize Hukou as a form of meso-level social citizenship, which to a large degree is about the portability of social rights under conditions of cross-border mobility movement. Now, the problematization of international mobility is not unique to contemporary China, as the construction of social citizenship always entails exclusion, inclusion, and boundary making. So international mobility was a problem before the establishment of national social citizenship in the European welfare state. And in the United States, there's a famous case called Edwards versus California, which you might have heard of. Basically, California prohibited the bringing of indigent persons from elsewhere to the state in their welfare and institutions code. And in 1941, the Supreme Court decided that the law was unconstitutional. A final point about the final slide in my conceptual issues section. So this has to do with the translation of citizenship in Chinese, right? So the interesting thing about this is that you have two ways of translating or articulating this concept in Chinese, but also in other East Asian languages, like in Japanese, as far as I know. Nowadays, I think it's more common to say gongmin, but still there are, in older translations and in certain cases, you could still see a citizen as 市民. And in civil society, in the translation of civil society, there's something similar. So you have 公民 society and 市民 society, with one emphasizing publicness and another emphasizing urbanity or the urban quality of a citizen. I actually got reminded of this by Eli's upcoming talk on urbanization of the people. Right, so this is a policy goal in the new type urbanization plan, and it's mentioned a lot. It's a buzzword in all the discussions about rural-urban integration and rural-to-urban migrants. Now, I think urbanization of the people is a good translation, but in some Chinese language academic articles, you can also see that it's translated as citizenization in their English abstracts and so on. And there also is a point there, I think, because there's always this connection between the idea and the ideal of citizenship and the urban. So I'll go back to this later, but I think ultimately the urbanization or citizenization of the people entails turning these migrants into proper urban citizens with appropriate rights, responsibilities, and certain desirable qualities associated with the discourse of Suju. Now, very quickly about that. Prehistory of Hukou, so the household registration system in Imperial China, but it's very different from what it is now. But I think it suffices to say that this institution of household registration has a long history, and is also influenced the similar practices in other East Asian countries like the Koseki in Japan. But then the functions were very different historically and now, and they're also different in different countries. For those of you who don't know, who don't have any prior knowledge about this, household registration or hukou is an administrative practice requiring all citizens to be registered with their local hukou authority, that is usually the Public Security Bureau. And so it's a form of civil registration system. And civil registration systems are, of course, extremely widespread across the world, and it's an essential feature of the modern states. But what's unique of this is that your official place of registration is tied to your access to certain social rights because the social security systems are fragmented and locally governed, and it can be difficult to change it when you have changed your residence. And so it's essentially about the portability of social rights. As I said earlier, when you go across boundaries of those social rights. But how difficult is it? It really depends. It depends on you, and it depends on the cities you are moving to. And we'll get to that in a moment. Next, I'm going to walk you through quickly the evolvement of Hukou policies in the PRC. So everything started in 1958 when the regulation on household registration was introduced. One interesting thing about the constitutional revision or the constitutional amendment is that in the 1954 version of the constitution, we had freedom of movement recognized in the constitution. But then it became like only on paper after this regulation was introduced in 58. And then it was removed altogether from the 1975 constitution and never got back. But of course, a lot of other political rights mentioned in the constitution are on paper only too. But the right to freedom of movement is absent at all. So this meant, with this regulation, it meant that people could not move freely from rural areas to urban areas. And there was this dual track registration system where you have two types of hukou. This has been abolished now. There were agricultural and non-agricultural types of hukou. And this mobility regime served to maintain the dualistic planned economy and also, of course, the dualistic welfare system, which is still very much dualistic right now, the welfare system, even though programs of rural-urban integration have been introduced in recent years or decades. For example, integration of different health insurance systems in urban and rural areas began in 2016, so quite recent. Another example is that currently rural and urban residents have different income threshold for getting subsistence allowance or basic living benefits in most provinces. But in places like Beijing and Shanghai, the standard has been unified. And this is a little, at the bottom of the slide is a little quote from Luo Ruiqing, then Minister of Public Security, justifying the regulation in 1958. So he said that it was about protecting the interest of the people as a whole. And the freedoms are freedoms with guidance, not anarchism, and so on. And then after the reform and opening up, you need migrant labor from the rural area to boost the economy in the coastal area. With that, we have the regulation. They have the regulation on the management of temporary residents in cities and towns. So it means people from the rural area can seek jobs in cities and towns, provided that they apply for and obtain a temporary residence permit. The notorious Danzhu Zheng. And internal migrants without this document suffered vulnerabilities similar to undocumented migrants in the international context. especially there was a procedure, an administrative procedure known as custody and repatriation, which resulted in a tragedy. But there were lots of tragedies resulted from that, of course. But the most famous one was the Sun Zhigang incident in 2003 that eventually ended this administrative procedure. So people could no longer be falsely removed simply because of lack of documents. Then after we entered the 21st century, there have been lots of initiatives, programs trying to improve the rights of migrant workers, because it's now really a social problem that a governmental problem that increases social tension in society. And you sort of want to introduce rural-urban integration plans and also new type urbanization plans. All these have to do, the central question to all of these programs is the rights and the governance of rural to urban migrants. The table on the top right corner is from my 2018 paper. It's a little dated now because it's the differentiated approach to Hukou acquisition given by the State Council in the 2014 outline. Then in recent years, so from 14 to 19 to now 2021, the population threshold for completely opening up has become bigger and bigger. In 2014, only towns and small cities should have a sort of completely open Hukou acquisition policy. But in 2019, cities were told that cities of a 1 to 3 million urban population should lift the restrictions. And the latest guideline from 2021 from this action plan for building high standards market systems goes that all cities except mega and extra large cities meeting appropriate criteria could explore residence-based Hukou registration. That means, once you are here, if you live here, then you should get a local Hukou. I'll get into the implication of this later, but some of the other things talked about in these policy papers. The first thing is abolish the distinction between agricultural and non-agricultural types of registration. That's the type of Hukou, it's not the location of Hukou. So it doesn't mean you can automatically change your Hukou to your place of residence. It only means that rural and urban residents now hold the same type of registration. And the policy documents also say we should promote equal access to basic public services based on this new type of document, which is 居住证 or residence permit or residence card, and the temporary residence permit or 暂住证 has been abolished. And then new urbanization as the urbanization of people, turning migrant workers or rural to urban migrants to urban citizens. That means having them, giving them equal access to basic public services, but also demanding them to acquire certain intrinsic or inherent internal qualities themselves as well. And also I'll talk about this when I get to the Suju part. So basically, I conceptualize Hukou as technology of social citizenship. And I think even though with lots of these reforms, it still holds true in 2021, as it determines to a large degree one's access to state-sponsored social rights, especially those concerning education, healthcare, housing allowance, and social security. And it creates a highly exploitable and profitable labor force, because precarious legal status, especially in the era of Chenchen Zhang or temporary residence permit, and lack of social provisions, makes them highly vulnerable to exploitative market relations. Even when Chenchen Zhang has been abolished, events like the Beijing eviction of 2017 show that the inclusion of certain sections of the population in the city is conditional upon their migrancy, temporariness, and deportability. So in that sense, it's quite similar to international labor migration, especially those temporary migration programs, and of course, undocumented migrants whose exploitability and profitability also comes from their vulnerable legal status. So institutional and market factors, which are not limited to Hukou. Hukou is just one among many other factors or obstacles, make some migrant workers' life in the city permanently temporary. So you see that actually only a minority of them want to have local Hukou, because even without taking that into account, they are quite aware that their life and work is temporary. So similar to many precarious migrant workers in from the south to the global north, this precariousness comes from both insecure legal status and exploitative market relations that are mutually reinforcing each other. In the Chinese context, then, this has hugely reduced the cost of urbanization, because the city is getting lots of young and exploitable migrant workers from the rural area without having to pay for the cost of labor reproduction, having to pay for their healthcare, education, and stuff like that. So the costs of labor reproduction are either minimal or displaced, because they have to leave their children at home. So the cost of labor reproduction are displaced to the countries, to the places of origin. And finally, it's a lot more about the rights of migrant workers. It's also an instrument of population management, of resource allocation, that facilitates other governmental goals or correspondence with other governmental goals, including industrial restructuring, urban transformation, and rural land ownership reforms. Then taken together, if you look at the trajectory of this from the 1950s until now, it has shifted from the dualistic rural-urban segregation to a multiplication of legal statuses, boundaries, and hierarchies of citizenship. So the inclusion-exclusion structure was dualistic before the reform, and now it's much more differentiated and multi-dimensional. There are differentiated rights in the city contingent on years of residence, income, educational attainment, quantified contribution to society, and so on, as you will see from the point-based system used in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. And very importantly, there's a further hierarchization of mobility between cities. So the hierarchy, the main sort of boundary is not between cities and rural areas anymore, but between different tiers of cities. And only the most powerful cities have the most selective migration policies. And another thing I want to mention is that under those projects of urban transformation and beautification, as we have seen in Beijing and Guangzhou, the right to the city is denied also to the urban poor with local hukou. And also in the case of Guangzhou, you see similar inclusion applies to international migrants, African immigrants, under this name of beautification and urban transformation and so on. So the boundaries are multiplied, and it's not just about the dualistic urban rural segregation anymore. So basically, I think this is about reorganizing the spatiality of the of what King Van Lim called uneven economic geographical development. So basically, the economic policies built on this hierarchical organizing of space within the Chinese state. So you have Eastern, Central, and Western regions. And initially, the coastal Eastern area gained the highest priority in integrating into the global economy, and has benefited so far immensely from the kind of migration regime we talked about. And now they are aiming to move upwards in the global value chain, whereas labor-intensive manufacturing industry is moving westwards to the central area. So if you look at the urban master plans of these first-tier cities, they all speak of optimizing not only industrial structure, but also optimizing their population structure. Also, if you compare this to the pre-reform era, you could say that migration control used to be relying on direct governmental intervention only, but now it's a combination of direct governmental intervention, including introducing population caps and implementing evictions and so on, and market-based mechanisms, such as like upgrading your industrial structure, urban development projects. Like in Beijing, they also sort of eliminated street level small businesses. And just to illustrate the hierarchy between cities, as you can see from this graph, it's a laser point. Only first and second tier cities actually have net immigration, and all the smaller cities are losing their population size. And even though Xi'an is a second tier city, but it's in the central region, so it's really not a popular destination. And it opened up its Hukou policy in 2017 to compete with other second-tier cities in attracting talents. And then you can see there's a dramatic increase after this in their Hukou population, but not so much an increase in their in the number of actual residents. And this is an entry barrier index developed by some quantitative researchers based on Hukou policies of different cities. And you can see there's a dramatic difference between them. And the four first tier cities are definitely the ones with highest barrier. So point-based system is the last thing I want to mention about this new emerging regime of citizenship and mobility, as I call it. So in a way, it's kind of a global trend. It's quite similar to the sort of point-based systems used in the global north to govern and filter international immigrants. But on the other hand, I also think this is a continuation of a long-standing tradition in socialist China, that is this belief in the power of quantification, a continuation of the rationality of scientific managerialism. So numbers are considered objective and scientific. And you can see that in the social credit system too. So I won't go through these points in any details, but just to have an idea how sort of difficult to get Hukou in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, even though it's very easy to get it in cities like Xi'an. And there's if you speak Mandarin, there's an episode from Gushi FM called "I Could Give Up Everything for or Anything for Beijing Hukou." It's worth a listen if you're interested in this kind of personal stories. And here is the point-based system for school admission in Shenzhen, in one of the districts in Shenzhen. And then you can see it's really a combination of different factors. If you have a local Hukou, but your parents live in rented houses, you actually get a lower score than if you don't have a local Hukou and your parents own property in the school catchment area. So this brings me to the last point about the Hukou section. In the Hukou section, that is, it's not everything. So sometimes there's a mystification of Hukou in the study of internal migration in China. There are apparently a huge number of papers, articles, studies on this, but it's become increasingly clear that it doesn't matter in lots of places. It doesn't really matter in much smaller cities, non-provincial capitals, and county level towns like my hometown. But it doesn't matter very much in places like Beijing and Shanghai. And those are the places where you have the most selective, restrictive policies. So it really depends on the power positioning of cities within the country. And if you consider the intention of rural to urban migrant workers to get local urban Hukou, as I said, only a minority have the intention to get it. But of course, it depends on your perspective, or how you would interpret it, because sometimes it's like it's so impossible that you won't even consider it. But still, those living in the first tier cities are most likely to say yes. And the top reasons for no are high living costs, fear. So for first tier cities, the biggest reason is high living costs. And in smaller cities, you have fear of losing rural land rights and also no stable employment, because the job is sort of temporary anyway. And as I said earlier, it's not the single determining factor of job and social security. So next is the content, the depth, or not the content, the depth of citizenship, right? The kind of qualities you associate with ideal citizenry. And that is the really complex Suju discourse. I'm using your super scientific graph from Google Ngram here. So you can see it's a discourse that really emerged since the 1980s, and I have no idea what happened here, but this is the end of the turn of the 20th century, around 1900. So I'm sure it means something different 100 years ago. But for now, it is this policy and everyday discourse that has become completely naturalized. And it has been used to describe, explain, and justify difference and hierarchy. What it exactly means is extremely diverse. It could range from mannerism, self-discipline, lifestyles, hygiene, education, to professional skills and entrepreneurialism. And the new type urbanization plan issued by the central government says that the main points, the goal of the new type urbanization is about urbanization of the people and raising the Suju of the population. Of course, this is like mentioning lots of other policy documents as well. So I'm at the beginning of this little sub project. The point I'd like to make here is that as a marker of difference and hierarchy between rurality or urbanity, uncivilized versus civilized, a subject versus citizen, the connotation of the term is really context dependent and is also evolving. So earlier depiction of so-called low Suju migrant workers really focused on their rural bodily habitus, as Yan Hairong said in an earlier article about Suju. So taking showers, brush teeth, stop fighting, and not to squat on chairs, something like that. And current discussion of Suju in the context of new type urbanization focuses more on qualities such as education, culture, professional skills, self-governance, and self-improvement, and knowledge of laws and rules and so on. So this is preliminary impression from looking through a quick glance at this comprehensive academic knowledge production on how to increase the Suju of rural to urban migrants and facilitate their integration into cities. So I think next I'm going to like take a closer look and have a proper content analysis of this knowledge or expertise. And importantly, it has been internalized by disadvantaged groups to rationalize inequalities and injustice. So this is a podcast made for migrant workers, and they have guests. They have migrant workers as guests, and one of the recent ones is a labor organizer, delivery worker. And the bad news, I think he's been arrested recently. So he's a delivery worker, and he has a mutual support group, and he's a great guy. But what's also struck me from that interview is when the host asked him, because he said it's difficult for us to unite, and it's difficult to have solidarity among delivery workers in the gig economy. And the host said, why do you think is that? I thought he would say because of the nature of the job, right? Because you are not like typical industrial workers and so on. But he said because most people have very low Suju. He's like, because delivery workers, they have really low Suju. So I think that's quite an extraordinary example of how it's been internalized by disadvantaged groups to rationalize their the kind of inequalities and injustice they experience. And because I do study international relations, what interests me too is also how it's used to produce imaginaries of global hierarchies. The typical narrative about this would be the low Suju Chinese people. There's a self-orientalizing aspect to it, and the high Suju Japanese and typically Westerners. And I just came across this, is that a time reminder? Did anyone give me a time reminder? No, sorry.
I just sent the link to the Dagong Tan.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so a recent speech made by Xi, he was, I think it's really interesting. He says that the younger generations can now look at the world as equals and no longer as, inferior to the Westerners, and they are no longer as tool as we were. So this binary of Tu and Yan is also quite interesting, which I have written on Twitter through a Twitter thread. But of course, it's not here is not the time to talk about this. But it's just how the Suju is part of this imagination about global hierarchies that's very much situated in the broader linear and evolutionary and dichotomous discourse of modernization. And also in Shan Shanlan's study on the Black threat discourse in China, so she identified these 5 themes, including low Suju, so how these anti-Black racist discourse used the Suju discourse to dehumanize or racialize Africans in China. But also, she made a point that I found quite interesting is that when you ask people who actually interact with Black Africans in China, they would, when they comment on their language skills, they would say, well, they're actually quite high Suju because they speak good English. And then that reminds me of how some friends of mine who worked on ethnic minorities, and they told me that speaking Mandarin would be considered characteristic of high Suju in ethnic minority areas. So these instances, I think, show that the changing context-dependent understanding and discourse of Suju is both reflective and constitutive of the global and national linguistic as well as cultural hegemony. So finally, I want to connect this to the social credit system, which has been very, very misunderstood. But I won't spend much time explaining what social credit system is, because that's just too much. So I just mentioned this aspects of the SCS regarding the disciplining of individual behaviors through scoring systems. But these scoring systems are very, very few. They exist only in a dozen cities, and they're not mandatory. But I talked to the civil servants in those cities where they do have the scoring system, and they use a scoring system to sort of encourage certain behaviors and punish, but not really punish, discourage certain other behaviors. And of course, they use the language of Suju. And they connect this also to things like legal consciousness, compliance, the sort of awareness to comply with contracts and so on. So I think it's quite similar to the construction of the meaning of Suju in the contemporary context. So it's not so much connected to the bodily habitus anymore, but more to this sort of being competitive and rules abiding on the market and also in society. With regard to the social credit narratives, I interpret this as combining different elements of liberal, socialist, and very ambiguous traditional subjectivities. So that's what the kind of subjectivity they try to construct through this concept of trustworthiness. On the liberal side, it's about the so-called modern contractual spirit. It's actually used in the Shanghai municipal regulation on social credit, the compliance with laws and contracts. And then certain socialist element that has to do with voluntarism in a community service, sacrifice, that kind of things, devotion. And then in the traditional area, it's very vague. It's just mentioned that trustworthiness is the traditional virtue. But when it comes to what that exactly means, it's really ambiguous. So anyhow, I think what's crucial about Hukou is that about the Suju discourse is that on the one hand, it really reifies existing social boundaries and difference. But on the other hand, it also promises the endless possibility for improvement. So Kipnis suggested that the concept blurs the nature versus nurture divide. And raising Suju is both an object of active intervention, of full governments, and the responsibility of individual citizens who must strive for becoming a high Suju person who is a competitive market subject and a rule-abiding member of society. So you could say that it's sort of connected to, so it has different sources of sort of intellectual inspiration, you could say it has some elements of Confucian idea of self-cultivation. And to me, it also sort of resonates with the subjects of improvement in liberal political reason. So anyhow, I think I'm talking too long. Thank you very much for your attention. And that's all from me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we will we'll take questions now. We have about half an hour left for discussion. So if you wouldn't mind using the raise hand function, then I can go ahead and call people in order. So open it up for questions or comments. Yeah, we have a question from Angela.
Hi, first of all, thank you for your talk. You mentioned sort of, you kind of went beyond the Hukou myth, and you talked about how there isn't a single determining factor of job and social security for these migrants. Could you mention what some of the other more significant factors might be then? Because I guess like from what I've learned in previous classes and read, it really is the sort of Hukou system that ties you to the social services you're able to access.
Shall I answer now?
Sure.
I think the most important factor is your type of job. So you said these migrants, but you know, migrants are not limited to migrants in temporary low-income jobs, right? There are also a migrant from Beijing to Shenzhen, as we have seen in that point-based systems used by Shenzhen public schools. So if you own property there, even if you don't have Shenzhen Hukou, you still have a higher score. So it could be an urban to urban migrant. You could have a very good job that provides you with job security and so on. So when we, of course, in this talk, we are looking at the kind of migrant workers who often hired by outsourced, like human, how do you call it? Those agencies, like not hired by companies that would provide them with social security. But from some of the stories I've read and documentary I've seen, there are also migrant workers who don't want to have that kind of jobs because they know they're going to be permanently temporary. They're going to move from city to city, factory to factory. And if you have to pay for social security contributions, then they're getting less and they won't be eligible for getting the benefits from those social security systems anyway, because you won't be here anymore. So I think it really depends on the type of employment.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Mimi.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to talk with us. My question is if you think that there's a connection. I know you're talking about how some people in like the podcast that you mentioned were seeming to like internalize their Suju status. And I was wondering if you think that there's a connection with that other study that you mentioned that people aren't interested in changing their Hukou status, or if those are sort of different phenomena.
Mm-hmm. I kind of think it's different. It's two different problems. So the reluctance to change Hukou status has a lot of contributing factors, right? Such as like the impossibility of getting a house, for example, in the city. The living costs is a huge concern. And also land has to do with the fear of losing rural land rights and some other factors. But these people, if you ask them, if you want to become a higher Suju person, I think they would have no problem. So it's not about being belonging to a social class they are confined to. I think I don't know, I think I'm losing my thoughts. But basically, I think these are two problems. And the thing about Suju is really that it promises improvement. It's not inherent. So it always asks you, the government, or if I use coding terms again, it's governing the self. So it's about asking you to constantly improve yourself, and it's possible. So you should educate yourself. You should try to raise your own Suju and become a higher Suju person.
I personally really appreciate the idea of Suju as sort of self-improvement, and it's a very difficult term to translate to English, but I think that notion really kind of resonates particularly with this American idea of constant self-improvement and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and stuff. There's a lot of, I think, kind of cultural resonance there, even if the terms are still somewhat different. So Leah has a question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I found this topic really interesting. I had two questions that came about from your talk. The first one related pretty closely to memes, and I might be conceptualizing this more in like a Western framework almost, like we were just talking about. But would you say that Suju is like a predictor of being able to gain Hukou because you may have access to like a higher class of like professionalism, which would be associated with like different mannerisms and stuff like that. I'm not sure if that's a far stretch of the concepts. And then my second question was, I know the reform efforts were kind of intended to like promote the rights of the migrant workers, but it also seemed to mostly benefit, the cities. So do you think that like migrants were actually made better off by these reform efforts?
On the second question, I'm not sure. I don't think I'd answer this because Hukou policies and also social policies differ greatly from city to city, province to province. So I think you really need lots of on-the-ground study, interviews and so on to find out if anyone is actually benefiting from this. But on the first question, yes, so the government and the academics are making this connection. That is, we should make the city suitable. We should make it easier for high Suju people to settle in the city. So that's the rationale. If you are well educated and if you are talented and if you have good professional skills, then you should be offered an opportunity in the city. So that's really, and also the academic discourse is about we should raise the Suju of migrant workers so that they could better integrate into the city. And I'm not saying that this is natural. I think this is constructed, and it's sort of producing new kind of boundaries, right? So before it's that you can't come, and now it's like, yeah, you can come when you have improved yourself, when you have become a more deserving member of society and a more deserving competitive market actor. So, so I think this is the rationality behind this discourse about the connection between Suju and rural to urban migration.
Very good. We have a question from Guangzhou.
Hi, can you hear me? I have a question regarding the Suju discourse. I was wondering if you saw any difference in terms of Suju requirement for rural migrants versus urban residents and acknowledged, classic national pastime. She talked about how the Suju discourse, the nature of it, how it's related to global capitalist production and how it produces docile workers, right? But I was wondering also if you saw how the requirement for Suju is different for urban residents and how it's probably more related to how maybe cities serve as the global economy, the global creative economy right now, right? So how requirements for them are different from those for rural residents or rural migrants.
So the question is about what do we mean by Suju when we talk about different groups of people, right?
Yes.
Like a rural and yeah, it's definitely different. And so as I was saying, it's very context dependent and constantly evolving. So in the end, I don't really know what we use it like. It's so naturalized. It's like an everyday, it's very everyday vocabulary. And we use it to describe difference and sort of justify hierarchy. But in the end, what it exactly means is really ambiguous to me. But I think the several points I've made earlier are maybe at the heart of it, that is being competitive on the market, on the job market. And that would have to do with educational attainment and sort of professional skills and so on. And then in the context of, I think this is somehow related to the idea of trustworthiness in the social credit system. So the goal is the same. It's about creating these subjects that comply to contracts and laws. So still it's very much has to do with being an ideal market actor. So yeah, that's my thoughts, but still, I mean, I don't have a satisfactory answer for that one.
Great. Next question is from Chu.
I'm Charu. Yeah, thank you for your speaking. I think the lives of the workers from rural areas are more difficult now. Workers who came 10 years ago or 20 years ago had better lives than now. Over the past few decades, house prices in the first line cities have risen dramatically. So when I worked in Guangzhou, there are lots of rural employees from countryside, but they said the room prices in the Guangzhou is very, very high, so they cannot relieve anymore first line. So what do you think about this problem? Chenchen.
The problem of housing prices rising.
Yeah. So so it's more difficult for rural employee. It's very difficult to live in.
I mean, I think it's always been difficult and it's worsened. But so in migration study, they call them first generation, second generation migrant workers as well. But actually, from what I've read, I think you said the first generation had a better living life quality, relatively speaking. But from the literature I've read, is that the younger generation are more willing to settle in the city, even though they might have to bear even higher living costs. But they are younger and they sort of came to the city at a younger age and feel more integrated in the city life and so on. But then, of course, facing these huge obstacles, both institutional ones and economic ones.
Okay.
Okay, next up we have Vicky.
Hey, I had a quick question about the Hukou system. So it seems as if it's a pretty controversial system to me, and it's led to all of the reforms that you talked about. I was wondering what the Chinese government's justification for the system is, how they justify the continued use of it, even though it seems like a lot of people have issues with it, and it seems like its primary use is to exploit these migrant workers.
You know, most of the time they don't have to justify what they do, right? But I showed you this very early justification from the 1950s. So as with anything, they could always say it's about restricting personal freedoms for the greater good. And now, so there have been debates, I mean, especially from certain academics, from certain activists, calls to abolish the system completely. And I think the government has been responding to this through one thing, making it more open. So opening up, especially at at the level of smaller cities. And then also secondly, by saying that we should sort of disconnect to some degree, disconnect to social rights, access to social rights from local status. So promote equal access to public services through 居住证, the residence permit instead of Hukou. So through this sort of, so whether it has a major impact is another matter, and we need to investigate that. But from the perspective of policy discourse, it's a sort of response, right? So even though we're not gonna abolish this anytime soon, but we are making it less relevant. We are making it less an obstacle for you to access social rights. And I think it also, as I said, in smaller cities is quite irrelevant. But in cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, it will always be, there will always be obstacles, even if there's no Hukou, there'll be other means. So it's really about, I think, this hierarchy between cities as well.
Great, Niall.
Thanks for your talk. I found this all really interesting. And one thing that was especially I was curious about is the way you mentioned the what the delivery worker organizer said on the podcast about Suju, because that made me wonder, like, do you think there's an implied relationship in that statement also between Suju and class consciousness, such that there's so much ambiguity in the term that Suju could be wielded in kind of the opposite direction as well. So you need a certain level of like Suju in order to understand your class position. And like, because it's so vague that people could use it to argue for and against, or kind of like take a Marxist position or take the state's position.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I would need to, you would need to talk to him to know exactly what he means by that. And this is probably difficult right now to talk to him because he's disappeared. But in that podcast, from my understanding, so basically he was saying from some of the other discussions, he was saying that most delivery workers are selfish, so they would care more about their pay, so obviously, instead of organizing themselves and doing something together, taking some actions, right? So it's almost like an excuse to sort of finding explanations for the behavior or the preferences of people who have very little choices in those situations. But in a way, I think it does connect to class consciousness, even if he was not aware of it. Like subconsciously, he might be making a connection between Suju and class consciousness. But the key idea is that really the ambiguity of it.
Excellent. So next up is Fletcher, and then I'm going to put myself on the list.
So yeah, thank you for your talk. One thing I'm wondering about Suju is like, it really reminds me of like American discourses of kind of like poor blaming and like, self-improvement as like poor people should lift themselves up and so on. And I know at least in the US, like there are a good number of people I think who kind of just reject that framing altogether. And I'm wondering who in China plays that role, if anyone, of kind of rejecting the whole idea of Suju at all.
So in the US, you said, what are the actors behind the promotion of this idea?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not even exactly sure. I guess I would say like politically left-leaning people would generally tend to kind of reject the idea of like poor people just need to lift themselves up. So I guess I wonder if there's a similar kind of counter discourse against Suju in the same way that there is at least some level of counter discourse against kind of other poor blaming narratives in the US.
First of all, in response to your first to the question how you framed it at the beginning, who is participating in this? Everyone is participating in this because everyone is using it in their everyday conversations, even though they don't necessarily mean the same thing. But this, as I said, is completely naturalized. And is naturalized to use it to discuss differences within the nation, but also between nations, between different peoples, right? Especially like Japanese people and German people are known as having a very high Suju. And as for counter discourse, I think it's really difficult to see in some academic circles, and not even in Chinese language academic circles, but mainly in the English language academic literature. There's a counter. There's efforts to be made to deconstruct this, right? But in the so on social media, for example, where I'm like kind of familiar with, there are counter discourses to poor blaming, but they would not necessarily frame it as something, as a critique of the idea of Suju. And also, I mean, if I have to make a really big generalization, but you have to be careful about this. But I think with the modernization, the mainstream modernization discourse in China, sort of social Darwinism is really quite prevalent. And if you read my articles about the right-wing nationalist discourse and a little article about the white left, you see what I mean by that. So belief in competition, belief in social Darwinism, also believe in this cruel cruelest competition between the backwards and the more advanced people. Because I remember this from my sort of national patriotic education, is that the lesson you learn, a crucial lesson you learn from history, is that if you are backwards, then you are meant to be beaten or defeated. So this is like, even though they teach you this in the history lesson, just to show you that, okay, China now really needs to become an advanced nation, so that she won't be bullied anymore and something like that. But this logic is very much naturalized and rooted in sort of popular thinking. I may be generalizing too much here, but I think that sort of social Darwinist thinking and should have something to do with the lack of counter discourse on this matter.
Thanks. So that actually, the question of the right-wing response connects to the question that I had wanted to ask. So I really appreciate the comparative perspective you have in that 2018 article in terms of thinking about the construction, the historical process of the construction of national citizenship, and how this was something that happened in England and the United States and other places. And thinking, and as you just mentioned in the talk, the kind of combination of bottom-up agitation for the construction of national citizenship and then sort of top-down responses. So, you know, we understand the sort of where the push for greater Hukou liberalization is coming from, and more sort of integration of people into cities and into social services. You know, but at the same time, we do have to acknowledge that there was a lot of social resistance, that this is not just like the big bad Chinese government keeping people out, that urban residents themselves have a lot of concerns about that, and that there have been sort of moments of counter mobilization. I mean, I think it was Suju a couple of years ago, they had this sort of, they were going to reform the university entrance exam, and, you know, parents were out on the street protesting, saying no. So, you know, so the question is basically, how big an issue do you think that kind of popular resistance within those post-elite cities is for a more generalized co-liberalization?
That's worrying, and I'm not too familiar with that kind of nativism in cities. I do know in some cities, like in Shanghai as well. So when I think there was a sort of attack from an unemployed migrant person, he attacked a kindergarten and killed a couple kids. And at the time, it really triggered a huge backlash against non-local people. So like they have a slang term in Shanghainese, especially for non-local people in the city. And there was quite a surge in exclusionary nativism in that period. But I can't like assess how large that force is in other cities or even in Shanghai, because it seems episodic. But what I also found interesting is its connection between perception of the Hukou system and xenophobia against the foreigners. It's all connected in a way, you know. Xenophobia in Western countries, or right-wing populism in Western countries, is also related to your perception of your own marginalization in society, right? Even though that perception isn't always true. but for example, last year when China introduced this draft regulation on permanent residence for foreigners, there was also a huge backlash online against giving foreigners any rights. It's a bit like that. And then when you look at those responses, quite a lot of them were about, we are not even equal citizens in our country. We can't even get those rights. Then why do you give foreigners those rights? So in a way, I think the perception of this internal inequality really also has an effect on anti-migration sentiments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Okay, we're almost out of time. So Angela, if you have one final quick question.
Yeah, so I had a question, sort of tangential question to your response to Fletcher's comment. Are these ideas of social Darwinism in China like primarily imported from the West recently, or do they also develop organically from inside China? Since Suju is originally a Chinese concept.
So I would trace this back to the kind of reformist or Enlightenment thinkers at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So they were quite similar to those in Japan around the same time as well. So they were seeing that this huge existential threat from Western imperial powers. And they were determined that we have to get strong, and if we don't get strong, we're going to be to become extinct. And also there were lots of so it was around that time a lot of vocabulary of social Darwinism were introduced into Chinese. So is it imported from the West? I would say yes, but also, I mean, sort of a global circulation of ideas. So there's this understanding of colonialism and acceptance of the logic of it. And then they continued to shape popular thinking throughout the 20th century, I would say. So it's definitely grown out of the encounter with Western colonialism at the end of the 19th century. But I mean, I wouldn't say it's like completely a foreign idea, because it's foreign versus indigenous binaries is also a little problematic. So after it got introduced, then it also got sort of reinterpreted and internalized.
Okay, guys, we're a little bit over time. So once again, thanks to Professor Zhang for joining us today, and hope to see all of you guys at the next CCCI lecture in a few weeks. All right, have a good day.
Thank you.